Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Kiana and I do a lot of sewing and fashion videos, and today we have a pattern and tutorial for this very romantic corset. If you're one of my subscribers, then you probably know I've been making this dress for my 26th birthday photo shoot. It's a photo shoot I do every year to commemorate the year, and this particular look was inspired by love letters. It has some handwritten love letters on both sides of the corset, and I think it's really pretty, and you guys really wanted a pattern for this top because it's actually a two-piece. The bottom is just a really simple gathered flared skirt, and of course the pattern for this corset is the first link down below, and you guys know that I love to give my loyal subscribers a discount code, so you can use the code birthday26 for 30% off this pattern until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time. You can also find all the required materials for this project in that first link down below in the listing description of the pattern, and you can find all the information on the equipment I'll be using throughout this video in the description of this YouTube video. I do want to make you guys aware of a few different things. So first of all, this ruffle and this sleeve, of course, completely optional. You do not have to do them if you don't want to. Both these design details bump this corset difficulty level up from more of a confident intermediate to more of an advanced level. I've also flatlined a bunch of my shell pieces with lace and chiffon, which is also completely optional. All right, but I think that's everything. Don't forget the pattern is the first link down below. Now let's just get into the tutorial. All right, before we get sewing, I want to clarify the 3 layers of the corset. There's the lining, which is the inner layer, the shell, which is the outer layer, and then the very optional 3rd layer that is sewn to the outside of the shell, which I'm going to refer to as the overlay, and this layer gets flatlined to the shell layer, and the overlay layer is 100% optional. So if you're not going to do an overlay, you can skip the first step, which is flatlining. So as you can see on the outside of my corset, I have this really pretty lace and chiffon, which are see-through fabrics. So to be able to sew these where you don't see the seam allowance, we need to flatline them. So I'm going to place my overlay pieces right on top of my shell pieces, right sides up for both pieces, and stay stitch all around the edge, aka based around the perimeter of your fabric within the seam allowance. I also personally didn't flatline my 2 side panel pieces because if you saw me creating this dress in real time, then you know that this was a love letters inspired corset. So instead of an overlay, I just wrote directly on the shell with a permanent fabric pen and created a love letter. Anyways, after you flatline all of your waist pieces, you can sew all the vertical seams of those waist pieces with everything right sides together. Do this for both the shell and the lining, and press your seams open. Moving on to the bust, first pin, sew, and press the darts on the front bust pieces for both the shell and the lining. Then sew 2 rows of basting stitches in the seam allowance at both the top and bottom of the front bust overlay piece. To sew a basting stitch, lengthen your stitch length all the way and do not backstitch at the beginning or end of the stitch. For the neckline, I'm actually going to sew 3 sets of basting stitches, so 1 set at each arm's eye and then another within the front neckline of the bust. Then begin pulling on the bobbin threads to gather the fabric for the overlay piece to fit into the measurement of the front bust piece. Then we're going to flatline the front bust piece with the front bust overlay. And again, to flatline, just stay stitch around the perimeter of the 2 pieces of fabric. Now just repeat the gathering and flatlining steps for the back bust pieces. Now take your bust front shell and the bust back shell and place them right sides together and sew them along the side seams, and then press open. Repeat this step for the lining. Now we're going to add boning to the waist pieces of the corset. You can either do this on the shell or the lining depending on the look you want. I'm going to add boning to the lining because I don't want any visible boning channels on the corset, but of course you can definitely do it to the shell as well if you want it to be more of a design detail. To add the boning, just cut your boning and casing to fit into the length of each of those vertical seams. Remove your boning from its casing, and then stitch the casing to the wrong side of the fabric and make sure the boning is placed directly in the center of each seam, and sew about a 1/4 inch away from the center of each piece of casing on either side. Once you're done sewing in all of the casings, just insert the boning back into the casing. You could also choose to make boning channels with the seam allowance of your fabric by pressing the seam allowance to one side and stitching down the seam allowance to make a channel. It's at this point that I'm now going to trim down the actual boning about 1 inch from its original length, because we are going to sew horizontal seams on either side of those boning pieces, and you cannot sew through the boning plastic, so we need to have seam allowance. Now just take your lining bust piece, place it right sides together with the lining waist piece at the under bust seam line, neckline and pin, sew, and press. And then you're going to repeat that step for the shell. Now moving on to the center back lace-up panels, I'm first going to interface both the shell and lining panels by fusing the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. And then this is completely optional, but as a design choice, I'm also going to flatline those shell pieces with my overlay fabric. Now I'm going to take the shell pieces and place it right sides together with the shell corset along the center back and pin, sew, and press that seam. And then I'm going to repeat that for the lining as well. Since I boned the lining, I'm also going to add boning to this seam on the lining. Though if you boned the shell, you would add this to the shell. So again, I'm going to repeat the exact same boning process as before, cutting it to the length of the seam, stitching on the casing, inserting the boning, and then trimming the boning down 1 inch. Now moving on to the straps. Again, completely optional, I'm choosing to flatline the shell fabric with my overlay fabric. I'm then going to press the strap into quarters long ways to create the strap. And then I'm going to stitch very closely to that open edge to secure the strap. Moving on to the sleeve. First, we need to fold the sleeve in half on the fold line, wrong sides together because we're doing a French seam. Pin along that curved edge and sew with 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance. Then I'm going to use pinking shears to trim down the seam allowance to be between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. If you don't have pinking shears, you can just use regular shears. But the pinking shears help the fabric to not fray and it helps reduce the bulk along the curve. Now press your seam allowance open, flip your sleeve inside out, give it another press, and sew the hem with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then press your seam allowance, flip it right side out, and you've got yourself a French seam. Now to make the pleats, make sure your sleeve is facing right side up and begin to close the notches by folding up the fabric and creating the pleats. If you look at your pattern, the pleats are clearly labeled so you can see where your fold line will be, where your placement line is. So you grab the pleat by the fold line and move it up and match it with the placement line. Then pin it into place and stay stitch along the edge to make the pleats permanent. Now we're going to connect the sleeves to the corset shell. Have your corset facing right side up and also have your sleeves right side up so you don't get confused. For the front area of the corset, line up the sleeves 1/2 inch in from the point of the corset. The sleeve needs to line up 1/2 inch away from that point because you're gonna sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance there and you don't want the edge of the sleeve to get caught here. For the back part of the sleeve, just line it up with the back part of your corset using the notches to line everything up. Now take your straps and pin those into place as well. Again, for the front part of the strap, you're gonna need to make sure it's 1/2 inch away from that point because again, you don't want to accidentally stitch the side of the strap when you're sewing with 1/2 inch seam allowance around the arm's eye. And then for the back of the strap, use the notch on the back of your corset to line it up. Now you can stay stitch everything into place, but if you're really confident, you can just place your lining corset on top of the shell corset, right sides together, and then pin along the neckline and down the center back seams. Then you're gonna sew with your normal 1/2 inch seam allowance around the center back seams, up one center back seam, along the neckline, and then back down the other center back seam. Now, before you cut any of your seam allowance or trim it or serge it, whatever you wanna do to finish the seam allowance, turn your corset right side out and make sure that you haven't caught the sleeve anywhere you didn't want to catch it because it's really easy for things to get moved around while you're sewing. And before you make anything permanent by cutting or serging, you want to double check in case you need to seam rip and re-sew. Now for me, I'm just going to trim down the seam allowance and clip my corners and clip into all of my curves before turning the corset right side out. Now I want to understitch along the neckline, and you're not going to be able to understitch down the entire neckline because it won't let you where there are corners. So to understitch, I'm just bringing the corset over to the machine with the lining of the corset pushed towards the left, the shell of the corset pushed towards the right, and the seam allowance underneath pushed towards the left towards the lining. I'm going to sew on the lining side of the corset about 1/8 of an inch away from that neckline seam, stitching through both the lining and the seam allowance underneath. This is just going to help the fabric to not roll out while you're wearing the corset. Understitch as far as you can until you start approaching the straps or a corner, and it will naturally force you to stop understitching because the fabric isn't going to lay flat anymore and you're just not going to be able to do it. Then pick up on the other side of the strap. Now this is the last time you're going to sew boning in, I promise. I know it's been a lot, but we need to insert boning right along the center back seam where the lace-up closure is going to be to prevent rippling. So just cut your boning again to be the length of the seam. This time we are not going to need the casing. We are going to just create a channel for the boning by stitching together the shell and the lining. My boning is 1/4 inch wide, so I'm going to create a channel that's 3/8 of an inch wide. Now, if you are putting the ruffle along the hem of the corset, do not sew this boning channel all the way down to the hem. You're going to need to stop sewing 1 inch away from the hem before you get to the hem. If you are not attaching a ruffle at the corset, you can sew all the way down to the hem. Now insert your boning, and again, if you are attaching a ruffle to the corset, you are going to cut the boning 1 inch shorter than the measurement of this seam. But if you are not attaching the ruffle, you can finish the seam with bias tape, in which case you will cut the boning to be 1/2 an inch shorter than the measurement of this seam. Now moving on to the optional ruffle. First, before we sew the ruffle in, we need to hem the ruffle. It's going to be so much easier to hem it now instead of later when it's attached and gathered. And I'm also going to hem the 2 short sides of the ruffle as well. We have 1/2 inch hem allowance, so I'm going to turn the hem up 1/4 inch twice and give it a good press with my iron, and then top stitch them to secure the hem with the sewing machine. Now sew 2 rows of basting stitches within the seam allowance of your ruffle. Do not backstitch at the beginning or end of your basting stitches. Grab the bobbin threads and begin to pull to create the gathered ruffle. You're going to keep gathering until the width of the ruffle is the same measurement as the hem of the corset. Once the 2 measurements are the same, just double knot your bobbin thread to secure the length of your ruffle. Now we're going to insert the ruffle. So like I said, if you are inserting the ruffle, the boning needs to be 1 inch shorter than the measurement of the center back seam, and your casing stitching also needs to stop 1 inch before the hem of your corset. So just a reminder, because that's going to be important to sew this seam. Now we're going to pin the ruffle along the shell of the corset. Do not pin it to the lining. You're going to pin the ruffle to the shell right sides together and start and stop your ruffle about 1/4 inch away from the center back seam. Now just sew the 2 layers right sides together. Then press your lining hem up 1/2 an inch. It's going to be hard to press up at the center front because of all the bulk of the seam allowance. So to help with that, I sewed a basting stitch right along the curve around the center front and pulled on the bobbin threads to gather it up to keep it in place. Then give it a good press again. Now you're going to match up the seam you just created with the ruffle and the corset shell with the new hem of the lining. And you're gonna pin the 2 layers together. Do this all the way along the hem, and then you're gonna stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. And this is going to secure the lining to the shell while also top stitching the corset at the same time. Lastly, we're going to add in eyelets. You can use whatever eyelets you want. I'm using 6mm gold eyelets, and I'm placing my eyelets 1 inch apart. Now just mark where you want your eyelets to be using some type of marking tool or pencil, and then just create a hole for your eyelets. Usually I like to use eyelet pliers, particularly the Duritz eyelet pliers, but this pack I purchased off Amazon came with some tools, so I just used these today. And then just insert your eyelets. After that, just lace up your corset using whatever ribbon you like, satin string, ribbon, cording, whatever you like, and then you are done. All right, that is how you make this very romantic corset corset top. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. Let me know what other patterns you want to see in the future. Of course, prom season and wedding season is coming up, so let me know your pattern requests below. Don't forget that the pattern is the first link down below and that you can use the code BIRTHDAY26 to get 30% off this pattern until tomorrow at midnight Eastern time. And make sure you're subscribed with those notification bells turned on so you don't miss out on pattern discounts in the future. But yeah, if you like this video, you feel like you learned something new, feel free to give me a thumbs up because it's the easiest way to support your favorite creators for free. Also, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. My handle is Kiana Bonollo. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.